They do.
Oh, they're okay. Sitting low like this in the front. hmm
We'll go ahead and get started. We're in John chapter 13, so if you have your Bible, turn over there or scroll there, whatever the case may be. And we'll start, we're just going to kind of dive into the text and pick up. And really what you've got in John chapter 13 through 17 is kind of a big unit of the text. And so the next few weeks are going to be a continuous story or a continuous event. And I've been trying to think about how to deal with it textually, thematically, and I think if we just go through the text straight, we're gonna see both. We're gonna do both, actually, the way John kind of has things arranged. So we're gonna start in chapter 13, and in a few weeks we'll be done with 17, and then we'll continue on. So just kind of think of chapters 13 through 17 as one big chunk. And one of the important things that shows up throughout that is the distinction between the disciples and the world. In those chapters, chapter 13 through 17, the word world shows up over 40 times. And there's constant distinction. Jesus calls people out of the world. You are not of the world. He'll say things like that. And so when you begin reading through that section, look at the distinctions that Christ makes between his people that he has chosen and the world. And so there's this calling out, a calling out of the darkness, out of the world, out of the domain of the devil. And so let's just look at the beginning, first chunk of text, verses 1 through 20. And what are some things that you guys notice in there?
Well, I think it's just interesting to kind of set the scene a little bit. You know, in chapter 12, Jesus' public ministry is over. And now we're at the Passover. Yeah. And it's also interesting to note when Jesus entered Jerusalem on the colt and they put palms down and branches down, the furor, the population just came out and they're crying that this is the king, this is the heir of David. And there's, you got to think the apostles were kind of overwhelmed with all this. So when we see later on that Jesus, the humility he demonstrates in washing your feet, and then we read in Luke, and kind of setting that up, Luke says that they were arguing about who was the greatest. Yeah. And it may have been just an ego trip kind of thing. And Jesus has been in, to the temple and cleansed the temple. And there's been a lot of things going on. So it kind of sets the tone of what we see, the humility demonstrated by Christ here in Luke's account, that they've been arguing about who's greatest.
Yeah, we tend to... I tend to forget that the people you're reading about in the text, they're humans, right? Just like you and me. And when we tend to idealize people out of history. Like if you go back and you read about the American Revolution and you read about some of these figures that did, these amazing things in the American Revolution, those are the stories that we're told today, but they were flesh and blood people too. And when you go back and look at the conflict that is happening among who we would call the founders of our country, there was just as much fighting between them about who was going to be in charge when they were done with the revolution as there was about getting rid of Britain. In fact, Benedict Arnold, who you may or may not have heard of, Benedict Arnold, one of the reasons why he tries to give West Point to the British is because he feels like he's been slighted. And he feels like if the revolution is successful, he will not be in as fortunate a position as he feels like he ought to be. And so within these movements, when people feel like they're part of something that is going to take control, there is all of a sudden infighting about who ranks where. And so that is a very human thing.
I think I love the way John's account is a very intimate view, much more so than the other gospel writers, and when he says he loves them to the end, even though they're frail, they don't understand what's going on, Jesus fully understands everything that's about to unfold. But they're very frail. They haven't gotten it, but he loves them till the end.
Yeah.
And I like it that, Peter, he knows Peter's heart, and later on he's going to say he's been cleansed, but then a little bit later he's going to tell him that he will deny him. And it's just all through this, starting at the end of 13 all the way through 16, it's, like you said, it's just one exhortation to them, because the times are going, the hours that are coming are going to be unbelievably challenging for them, and he knows what's going to unfold. Yeah.
I'll talk about it. Tied to that, he ends chapter 12 talking about where his words come from. In essence, he said, I speak as God speaks because I can tell you exactly what God says to say. And then he goes right into chapter 13. He loved him to the end. Why? Because God said. He served. Why? Because God, that's what we are to be. And I think John really lays down that as the cornerstone on which everything hinges that we're going to see from this point forward. We're going to see God's love expressed in every single way you can imagine, with his death, with his will, with the love, with the relationship, with the glory. Everything else is all tied to their oneness and our adherence to his word when we believe.
Yes.
It's interesting to me when we see the law Moses given. The people are so afraid; they're just terrified. And yet here we see Christ with his apostles, and John's leaning on his breast, and it's just an amazing comparison to think about the humility of Christ and the relationship that he wants with these men. And,
Yeah. And to kind of draw from that, this love, when you read through the text, there is an undercurrent, right? There's a minor major player in the story here, which is Judas Iscariot. The text kind of focuses on him for a bit, and we'll get into this more in just a little while, but pay attention to how much Jesus loves Judas. How close Jesus is to Judas, and the way that he treats him, not just here, but throughout his ministry. He knows Judas is going to betray him. He's going to indicate as much here in the text. And he doesn't treat him like a betrayer. And if there's one thing, just to kind of put that into kind of the forefront of our thinking as we begin moving through the text, if Jesus treats Judas that way, high-handed, open, bold-faced rebellion, then he'll treat me in a similar way. And so like you were saying, the God that we are coming to, when we are coming to him, we are not terrified of him. There is a reverent respect because he is God. But the revelation that we have of God in Christ is what John will say. God is love. God is love. And we see that even here, Jesus, when he says, love your enemies, he puts that into practice. He doesn't just say this nice thing because it sounds good. He says it because that's who he is and that's what he does. And so it's powerful. So what do y'all think about moving into verse 2? What do you think about the devil? The devil had put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. What does that mean?
Well, it is interesting. This is really difficult for me to understand how this, but it's amazing to me that Judas could have witnessed all the things, for 3 years, and yet his heart is not like the hearts of the other apostles, and that he would let Satan in. And it's just there's a spiritual battle going on even today that we don't see all the or understand everything that's going on. And I have to admit, this is a very difficult thing to understand how all this works with Judas and Satan. But Satan had entered, Judas had left the opening for Satan to come in. He just had not. And the other apostles didn't understand either, but
right.
Yeah, but he clearly didn't have the faith that the other apostles had.
I mean, one thing it shows is no one's safe or exempt from temptation. I mean,
Yeah.
He's one of the closest to Jesus through this whole time, and here he comes, so it's a warning for sure.
And
But-
it's also consistent with what we see in the previous chapters about the choice. This is no more mystical or less mystical than us choosing to sin. That's the devil. That's Satan. He's not making us do it. We're choosing to do it. In the Old Testament, he said you have a spirit of whoredom and a witchcraft. Well, they weren't walking around mystically overcome. They were serving Satan. And so they're condemned for that by the prophets. The Israelites were. Well, it's the same thing here. He made the choice not to believe, which is the theme that John's been saying. There's a choice you make and a consequence to that choice.
I believe it was back in John 10, wasn't it? Jesus said there's a devil
Yeah.
Yeah.
amongst us. I mean,
Yeah.
Jesus knows everything that's about to unfold
Yes.
on that evening.
But what you said earlier, though, is what really stood out to me. We all watched enough movies and seen enough TV shows, and when there's this great betrayal, it's a surprise, and Jesus is sitting here. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and he doesn't, he could take care of this, and he doesn't, because it has to go through, but he's still showing Judas love. And I think that's one of the more amazing things out of this whole just scene, right? I mean, he's sitting right there beside him. He knows what's going to happen, and Jesus still treats him as one of the others.
And it doesn't absolve us. But whatever is happening in the spiritual realms that we can't see, we are never absolved of our choice. And so, yes, this definitely says that the devil had put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. But the text also, Satan is definitely to blame, so is Judas. And we can't lose that.
And so we were asking, how is it possible that Satan could enter his heart? Physically, Judas was so close to Jesus. He went with him everywhere. But obviously, in his heart, there had been left room. Maybe he wasn't so close as it seemed. And we have to be careful that though we attend services and we go through these acts, that we are not leaving room in our heart for Satan to enter as well, because it can happen. It would happen to his disciple. And we have to be actively, constantly filling ourselves with what? With God's Spirit. And that's, we have to be reaching out for God's Spirit to be filling us so that there is no room for Satan to enter our hearts.
That reminds me of a story that Jesus would tell about how a man came and he drove a spirit out, and the spirit left, and then the guy put his house in order but then didn't fill it with anything, and the spirit comes back and brings with it 7 more spirits more wicked than itself. That's exactly right. Yes.
So I look at how motivated Satan is to destroy Jesus. He is so motivated. And one of the tools that he uses is he comes to someone so close to Jesus. How am I going to get him? I'm going to come to one of his inner circle. And I think that's a lesson to us that, Satan will use every power that he has to get us to betray our God. And, you go back to, Revelation 12, when he was determined to destroy that son. And if he's that determined with that, there is that spiritual warfare, and we need to have our guard up of, if he would use someone so close to Jesus that had followed him around, what will he use with us? One of our own here? Yes, maybe. So I think we need to be on our guard.
If you think you're strong, beware lest you fall. Yeah.
He probably tried with all the apostles. It's Judas that we know made the decision, but James and John had an issue with pride, and devil could have easily have used that as a way in. And it's just he broke through with Judas, I feel. So, but I have no doubt that he was working on all the apostles because they were in that inner circle.
Yeah, and Jesus will actually say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," right? Calling him adversary. So, I think you're right. It comes down to personal choice. Okay. All right, so as you kind of move through again, Jesus knows what is happening. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, in verse 3, he gets up from supper. And so he knows that all this is happening, and then he's going to wash the disciples' feet. Yes?
The verse where Jesus says, what you're about to do quickly, helps us to understand that it seemed that he said it with some sense of calmness that was at the time. And the thing that I think we need to recognize is Jesus was still in control when he said this. And it was his determination when he would die, not the determination of others. So he was in control of all of this. And I think that's important for us to recognize that even though he understood and seen everything playing out, he was still in control. Regardless how powerful Satan thought he was in affecting others' hearts, Jesus ultimately was still in control.
You'll see the humanity of Christ. You'll say he's troubled. And then later on, we get to chapter 17, his prayer in the garden. I mean, even though he knows all these things are going to unfold and it will glorify God,
Yep.
It's a stressful time for Christ as well.
Yeah, absolutely. He struggles with it in a similar way that we would.
Even though he knows the outcome.
Yes. And so don't feel bad. You know, I mean, the specter of death looms in front of us always. And it's scary and it's stressful. But you see the Son of Man going through that same stress, albeit in a much greater way than many of us will. He gets through it with that knowledge that God is in control, God has a plan, God is going to do these things, and we have that same promise. And so even though we feel that stress, right, it's the same type of feeling, the similar type of feeling that Jesus had, we can overcome it the same way. And so I do think that is very powerful, that we see the humanity of Jesus. So then we've got this foot washing thing. And unexpected. There's a lot of unexpected things in the gospel. Somebody already mentioned the closeness of the betrayer. That would be unexpected. And now you have the Son of Man coming, the creator of the universe, literally, when Paul says over in Philippians 2 how he took the form of a servant, he literally does that. And so not only did he come in flesh, the form of the creation, but he comes in the form of a servant amongst the servants. He clothes himself like a slave here in the beginning of John chapter 13, and he goes around and he does the servant's or the slave's job. He goes about and he cleans the feet of all of his disciples. And there's this really powerful picture of Jesus taking the dirt and the grime and the nastiness of the earth off of their feet and onto himself. And so he takes their dirtiness onto his own person in this image of him going around and washing their feet. It's very, very powerful. Not only in Jesus humbling himself, but in that service, what he is actually doing. And when he is done, then he tells his disciples, now you're clean. And at the time, it seems like they don't understand what's going on. But later, after the cross, when you look back, now there's this image of Jesus taking my filth onto himself and then calling me clean. That's powerful. What other things do you guys see in there?
Well, I wonder who was the first to have their feet washed, because it said then he came to Peter.
Yes.
And then that's when the flax starts. But it's sort of reminiscent of John the Baptist saying, I'm not worthy to baptize you. But, of course, I think Peter's response is a lot more, I don't know what the right word for that would be. But
emphatic.
He's a lot more energized about this. He's not going to let Christ do this. But that's Peter.
It is Peter. It's the same thing when Jesus says he's going to die.
Yeah.
And Peter says, no.
This doesn't seem like something a teacher would do for his students. I don't know. As I read that, I don't know what the culture was like, but
No,
as
you're
I
right.
read that,
You're right.
To Jay's point, this was the most menial of a servant's tasks. They would serve the food and that kind of thing. They were honored places. This was not an honored place. But it was also a common practice to wash the feet of your guests because of the dirt and grime you get on your feet. And it's interesting, not only did he wash their feet, to your point, but later he says he's going to apply this in a very real way. And what we find out is that God serves.
Yes.
Serves perfectly and serves to the need of the person that's being served. This is a very powerful message at several levels.
Yeah, we say Jesus is a servant king here for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And we tend not to think of God. We're formed by our culture. And in our culture, powerful people don't serve those under them. They are served. And so there are statements throughout the gospel accounts where Jesus says things like, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve. Those are jarring statements. And they should change the way that we view God.
Yeah, this is not the first time that he's made allusion to this, and that they just don't get it. They don't see the Messiah being who Jesus is. They don't fully appreciate it. They will,
Yes.
in a matter of hours, they will see it fulfilled. And I think that's one of the things I struggle with, especially in John's account, how much is happening in the matter of a few hours.
Yes. It's like the last third of the book.
From the time we're reading these events, in less than 24 hours, Jesus will be in the tomb. It's unfolding very quickly now.
Yes. And
But I was just going to say, I think, kind of to the points we're making, this is the last time he has with these men, his close friends, and this is what he chooses to do. It's God's character is definitely on display here. He could have done all sorts of different things, and he decided to wash their feet. It's very amazing.
Well, it's the indication that there's no salvation apart from Christ. If you're not cleansed by Jesus Christ, you're not.
yes.
You
And
don't have
I
salvation.
kind of smile where he says, what I'm doing now you don't understand, but you'll know later on. It's like, that's kind of a lot of his whole ministry. I don't know that there was a lot of things I think they didn't really understand, especially kind of what happens, obviously, with the crucifixion and things. So I know he's probably talking about this exact act here, but there's kind of other things it seems like that are going to come along later that they're going to remember. We even read that they remembered later of what he said and kind of made sense of it.
So in this washing, when he is done, later he will say, I have given this to you as an example that you should do just as I have done. And now there's some people who have read through that and they say, well, then we need to wash each other's feet. And I would make the argument that if we were alive back in the ancient world in first century Palestine, that you would be correct. That should be what we should do. And I mean, if you really want me to wash your feet, I will.
I'll pass.
Thank you. So what does he mean? I have given you this as an example that you should do just as I have done. What does he mean?
Well, I think that's answered just a sentence down. I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master. It's about the humility of love. You can't truly love someone if you don't have a humble spirit. And Christ is just demonstrating that in the most servant-like thing that he could do at that time. And they didn't wash each other's feet when they came. They're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And I just can't get that out of my mind when you stop to think about that. When you go back to Luke's account, that's what the argument's going on. And Christ answers that argument by washing their feet.
Yeah, it's the opposite of the world. Our world is a race to the top, and in Christianity, it's a race to the bottom. That really is the powerful thing of this. Serve one another. And then later, by this love, all people will know that you are my disciples. It is this servant love. The dominating love is love of self, in our culture. I'm going to do what's best for me. I had a psychology professor tell me one time, in any situation that you're in, just expect the other people to do the most selfish thing possible. And you'll be right like 95% of the time. Because that is what we do. We act in our own best self-interest. And Jesus here is doing the opposite of that. And so it's powerful. It truly is countercultural. It's in every circumstance.
In verse 17, if you know these things, if you can grasp this,
Yeah.
you know, you'll be blessed.
In this life, you know, a husband to a wife. Husband's the head of the wife in a biblical pattern, but how many times does that involve serving her to show her that you love her? You think about a parent and a child. Who's in charge there? The parent, if it's done right. And yet, you change diapers. That's not much different than washing feet in a world where people had open sewage in the streets. You know, to change a diaper when when that person can't, that is serving them. That is becoming their slave in a sense.
You know, Jesus is still washing our feet. We may be living a good life, but we still have sin in our life. And if we're doing the best we can, we still need our feet washed. And because Jesus died, he took our sins and washed our feet. And that's the only way we can be clean, is if Jesus washes our feet.
Absolutely.
In this Last Supper about who was the greatest. But instead he went into action and he showed them something that was probably much more impactful, something that they would definitely take with them from this point on throughout their life. And I think that lesson was the best lesson that he could have told them at this point in their life.
Yeah, this whole section up through the end of John 16, it's very compassionate work. To me it is. It's a very compassionate appeal to them. Yeah.
And that idea of compassion, before we run out of time, because we've got to get down to the end of the text, into the new commandment. When we start talking about who is going to betray, it's surprising. Nobody expects this. I imagine when Judas goes to the chief priests, they were surprised that one of the inner circle would come. But this idea of compassion, when you look at the events, John doesn't tell us where anybody is seated except for himself. Right? He is the one who is right next to Jesus, on one side of Jesus. When they were eating, they had adopted kind of the Greco-Roman style of eating, so they're reclining at the table. They're kind of leaning up against the table. For Jesus to be able to reach out and take a piece of food and hand it to Judas means that Judas is right next to Jesus. And not only does it mean that Judas would be right next to Jesus, it would actually mean that Judas is in the place of honor. And so at this gathering around the table, no matter what order Leonardo put them in, Judas is right next to Jesus in the place of honor. And when you read through the customs of the ancient world, it was traditional for the host of the feast to reach into the food pot, to take the choicest morsel and hand it to the guest of honor. And so in all of this, in this entire situation, Jesus is treating the betrayer with the highest degree of love, with the highest degree of intimacy and closeness. It's almost like this is Jesus' last attempt to draw Judas back, and he does it with love.
I was just going to make that point. This is all to bring him back when it's all said and done, to repent, which is incredible for us to understand and think about. Yeah. I think the other thing to see here is that Jesus, it appears that his weakness was money. Mm-hmm. And yet he's the one that handles the money. And I think the lesson there is we're going to have to face the thing that separates us from the Lord and deal with it. And we either deal with it correctly or we fail. At the end of the day, Judas failed. But Jesus did everything he could other than make his mind up for him, everything he could to bring him back when it was all said and done, which is just incredible. Again, knowing what he knew, everything is coming.
In verse 30, it says he went out immediately, and then it says it was night. And it was night. It was probably around 9 o'clock or something like that. But spiritually, it was night too. It was darkness.
Yeah.
It's starting to unfold. It was night.
And if you reject the love of Christ, as Judas does, very graphically, what else is there? There's nothing. Right? And that's where you get like into the words of the Hebrew writer, where he talks about how for one who has rejected this, there is nothing to draw them back. It's talking about this type of situation with Judas. It's not saying don't try and chase the lost sheep. I mean, we see Jesus doing that very thing. But at the end of the day, if the love of Christ will not compel you, what else can God do? I think that's why you get Jesus' words. What you do, go do quickly. You know, I've done everything I can. Now you have to decide. And I think I have missed that for a long time. What you are going to do quickly. I've often thought that's Jesus kind of saying, well, Judas, just go be wicked. It's almost like Jesus is saying, I've done what I can, now you have to choose. And that's still true today. We have to choose.
I'm glad you referenced the painting, because I looked at that in a long time and actually went and Googled that and was just kind of looking at it, just because that obviously, Leonardo's painting obviously is supposed to be drawn of kind of this moment. Jesus reveals he's going to be betrayed. Not that that matters or anything, but it is interesting to go and look at it and just kind of see what that looks like. But I think one of the things that's interesting here too, the disciples looked at each other. They didn't know who it was, and we kind of made that point earlier. It wasn't obvious that any one of them was just the bad guy, right? I mean, it very much was a surprise to everyone.
I think in the other Gospels, it even says, is it me?
Yeah.
They were taken by surprise with this.
Yeah. And it's kind of scary on one hand, because you never really know. But on the other hand, it's not scary, it's humbling. And that making those kinds of judgments, it's not my job. It's not my job to decide who is saved and who is not, because I can't know. Here's these 12 guys who have been with Jesus for years, and when Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me, they had no idea who it was. And so if at that moment Jesus said, all right, Peter, you're the judge, pick the betrayer, he would have gotten it wrong. And so at the end of the day, I can't do God's job. The only thing that I can know when I am seated at the table, so to speak, is what I do. Am I going to allow Christ to wash my feet? Am I going to become like him? Am I going to have this love? Am I going to have this relationship with Jesus? Am I going to do that? And so at the end of the day, the only person that I really know that I can judge is myself. And we have to let that grace, we kind of have to be gracious then with other people, because I'm not their judge. And that is a theme that is going to run throughout the text of the New Testament, to live with one another in an understanding way, to be peaceful so far as it depends on you, to not take God's judgment seat in James 4. And so there's just this theme that builds throughout that I think we see here illustrated with the surprise of the disciples. They had no idea, because they're not fit for that job. Right? They're not fit to judge. They're fit to be faithful and to serve. And that's our responsibility. So let's... The statement right after it is night. Then Jesus says, now the Son of Man is glorified and God is glorified in him. And so this betrayal, I can't remember who mentioned it, but this idea of Satan powerfully at work, using all of his tools. And the end result is that the worst that Satan can do brings about the exact thing that God desired. And so if we will trust what God says, if we will do what God says, God will be glorified. And throughout the text of Scripture, there are two things that happen. People obey God, people don't obey God. In both situations, God is glorified. God gets glory through his faithful people, or with his faithful people, and God gets glory over the disobedient. And so ultimately, again, here's a human choice. How will God be glorified in your life? Will God be glorified through you? or will God get glory over you? God will be glorified either way. It's your choice how. And so again, we see that it's a really powerful image here. God will be glorified either way.
I just think that's interesting. That's his first words out of his mouth after he leaves. And as terrible as the events that are going to unfold over the next few hours, it's all to God's glory.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what else did y'all notice in that section with the new commandment? Verses 31 down through 35. We've talked about it some, but is there any other things? I think
Well, where I'm going, you cannot come. Only Christ could fulfill what was about to happen.
Yes.
The apostles couldn't be. It was all Christ. The work on the cross was all his to bear.
Yep.
Yeah. But it's like the words of encouragement. You know, these are like words of encouragement. You need to love one another, because this is, of course, he's going to elaborate more in the next few chapters, but yeah.
Yeah, where I'm going, you can't come, but later you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing to see here, in addition to that, is this is a command. This is an imperative. I was listening to a lesson recently, and the fellow who's a Greek scholar pointed out when Jesus says, "Let him hear," what he really is saying in the Greek literally is, he must hear. And what Jesus is saying to them is, we tend to think, oh, it's great that we love one another and look at. This is the imperative that we have to apply. And he says, when you live this, the world's going to see you're different than anybody else. That servanthood and everything else, that service to each other that we see played out in Acts. You know, to me, it just struck me that, and I've read past it every time. It says, well, here's the mark of a Christian. Well, it's a command, and if we're not doing that, we're not. We may be doing good stuff, but it's not for this. We're not doing what God said. I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and that's what we'll end with, that thought, is that if all we get if all we do is get together and say nice things and maybe do some nice things, then the church is no different than any other social organization. And I mean, just choose which one you want then. But if this is the centerpiece of Christianity, this self-sacrificial love, this emptying of the self for others in the way that God does, then Christianity is different. And so, yeah, that's like the thing that Jesus is teaching. So we'll finish there, but again, this is a continuous thing. So as we read into next week, chapter 14, the conversation is continuing on. Thank you all for your comments. We'll pick up next week.